A huge component in my work is fighting stigma. And isn't it ironic that, sitting here talking to you about my experience as a consumer and an employee puts me in a precarious position to lose my job?
At the time, I thought, well, technically, I suppose that could be a reason why, but other jobs had come up that were exactly my job description, that had been for a 9-to-5 shift that I could have done no problem. But no, can't take her back because A, I'm a liability, I'm costing the company money in all these benefits. And B, well, she's unknown. She's an unknown commodity. She could go nuts in the newsroom, and we can't have that.
You were sort of given the grace of one time off. Beyond that, there was a real sort of feeling of stress leave, meaning that you can't cut it, and maybe if the kitchen's too hot, you should get the heck out.
It was definitely a cross to bear to have that known in the workplace and have people just suspect that I might do something that was improper and always being on guard for me. Not a good feeling.
And one day, everyone was there, the whole staff were in the kitchen working, and he says, "Something wrong with you. There's something about you. I don't know what it is. There's something wrong with you." Geez. Next thing I know, there's an ad in the window for looking or hiring or whatever, help wanted.
It's one thing to be stigmatized because you're crazy, as the world sees you. It's an entirely different thing if you're considered unfit to raise your child because you're crazy. So you've got sort of a double whammy happening there.
She also told the little boy, who was only 7, that I was violent, that I had periods where I was violent and I was a bad person and he shouldn't have anything to do with me. And as a result, this little boy, when his dad took him out, I was ostracized from them. I was not allowed to be with the two of them when they went out to do anything, to have him over to our home. He wasn't allowed. His mother made him be afraid of me.
The only way I can describe that feeling, and not just my ex-husband, but other people, it's like having a bucket of slime poured on you. It's like you're being reasonable. You're in a fair fight, and then all of a sudden the fight's not fair anymore because they say, "You're sick." Huh?
Well, my sister and my other family, because there were so many bizarre behaviors and suicide attempts and drunken episodes and things like that, they're to a point now where they love me, but they don't really expect much of me, and they don't think I'm capable of a whole lot.
I find, and I think with Sue too, and a lot of people, is that the contact starts being avoided. I mean, you don't get together very often. You might phone or write a letter, but it becomes too uncomfortable because they're stigmatized too. Other people will look at my parents and say, "They must have done a really lousy job. Look how messed up that guy is." When in fact, it's an illness. It's a biological thing.
Almost all of them took a step back and went, "Oh, well, oh, okay, so there's something new and different about you," when really there was nothing new and different about me. It was the same as it had been, it just now had a name. And as soon as they went, "Oh, okay, so you're different now," the little voice in my head, my own self-stigmatizer, said, "Yes, you're right, I am different and I am unworthy and I'm sorry for all the burden I am going to be of you having to take care of me as a friend or a relative."
Self-stigma is the toughest Because if you start believing something, you know, like the human mind is a very strong, very powerful, and you start telling yourself that you can't accomplish anything or that you're no good, like it doesn't take much for every aspect of your life to be affected.
There would always be a finger pointing at me saying, you're not doing a good enough job. You're not doing a good enough job. And it's this. I mean, this is self-stigma. I mean, it's like, you wouldn't do it to him, but to do it to yourself is like, go away. You know?
Well,
Like,
that's true because, you know, oftentimes if you do your job right, you know, you're hired to do something, you do it well, they're happy. They don't care if you're mentally ill or not.
there are a lot
That's where the self-stigma really comes in, because you're out there with a gaggle, a huge crowd of people who are considered, who you know you're different, you're wired a little differently then. And that's when maybe I really engage in self-stigma. I will have trouble until I get comfortable, until, you know, on a job, if I can get a job. But that's like what Sue's saying, is that's the worst time for self-stigma for me, is when I'm out trying to do what everyone else does on a daily basis.
You know, you get into this mindset where it can't possibly be that. Oh no, I'm not that person. And you fight so much against it that you look at the treatment and the help that you need for that disorder as being the worst thing in the world. That's the stigma. Well, if I go get the help, then I must be crazy, or that's admitting to it. Whereas you fight so hard, you got to get yourself to a point where you fight harder to not acknowledge the illness as you would have had to fight to overcome it.
My medication compliance was not very good for many, many years, basically because of the stigma and because of the us and them kind of thing. I didn't want to be one of them, those mentally ill people that I had worked with that weren't able to cope and run their lives. I didn't want to be one of them. And so if I didn't take medication, that meant that it really was just a matter of me pulling up my socks and getting going. And I could always pull up my socks for a short period of time, and then I would crash.
Self-stigma, you know, it's still, even though I work in mental health, it's the notion that, you know, I'm highly educated, I come from a good family, I've had opportunities, that I should be able to pick I should be able to pick myself up by the bootstraps, which is such a mythology about depression.
I was always persecuting myself. Why did this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this? Is this, a fault of my father or my mother? Does this come from their lineage? Why am I like this? Why is my sister okay and I'm not? So that kind of thing. And then just the persecution, the shame and the guilt of having to go forth with the knowledge that you had this illness and whoever you were with was fine. And they didn't have it, and they didn't have to take time off work, and they didn't have to take medication, and they didn't lose control and act out whatever the symptoms might be. And I did. And then when I did that, I guess the shame part of it was that people would think there was something wrong with me.
I would go, aha, see, I'm right. I am worthless. That's what it's all about. And I should have known long ago that I don't deserve to be treated well. I don't deserve people's, interest or compassion because I'm really, just this terrible waste of space.
The saddest part of self-stigma is that people don't even know they're doing it. It's so... we don't live in a culture that, tells you that having a mental illness is okay. We live in a culture that tells you that having a mental illness sucks, that you're useless, you can't be employed, that you can't do things by yourself. It's really hard to find your own voice. What I would encourage people to do is, if they can't find their own voice, to find a voice that they'll listen to. I like to encourage people to just try things, you know. There's nothing wrong with not being able to do them if you try. There is something wrong with being too afraid to try because somebody else told you that you can't.
I would ask them to remind themselves of all the successes in their lives. You know, there's a time to break down and a time to build up. And in a time like that, that's a time to build up.
Try to see themselves as being normal with normal feelings, like Cameron says, to you know, realize that everybody has these feelings. The thoughts that you have need medicine, but your reaction to things are quite normal, and we all stay within our boundaries to a certain degree. Hopefully the boundaries overlap.
I recommend unlearning everything you've been told about mental illness and learning the facts. I would suggest that there are resources to do that and that they search them out, especially now with the internet and so forth. There's umpteen books in the library. If you can't read, some people can't, find someone to talk to, someone older who's been through it.
I would suggest finding a group, where a mood disorder group where you could meet other people and find out why they felt the way they did and what they've gotten over. And if you see, you know, in a group encounter, there's always the worst person that's having the worst problems and is so down. The other people go to their rescue, even though they're afflicted as well. They'll go and they'll comfort that person and they'll offer support, and you know, in terms of how they got support from someone and how they learned how to be strong. You have to believe in who you are and not let people tear you down and call you names and put you in a category of misfits human beings. That you have to believe in who you are, and if you have the illness, you know, work on that. Like in some ways you have a gift to have this illness because you can see and hear and perceive things differently than a person who doesn't have a brain disorder.
Buck the stigma that you're feeling. Whatever it is that you're feeling, do the opposite. You know, you feel you're that man with the dirty old overcoat on, and, you know, go to Sally-Ann and buy a little suit jacket or something and a t-shirt, you know. If you're mumbling to yourself, talk to your doctor. Maybe there's a medication that'll help that, you know, like whatever stereotype you're feeling, you know, you can always fight it.
I think being clear that mental illness is not your fault, being clear that you have a right to be in this world along with everybody else, and feeling those things yourself, so that you don't have to be proud of mental illness. I don't think I know anybody who's proud of mental illness, of having mental illness. But I think as long as you feel that you're an okay person, even though you have mental illness.
Well, first get over that little voice that's leading you to believe the stigma in the first place. Because if I hadn't had a predisposition to say, you're worthless, you're no good, you know, nobody will ever love you, whatever else. If I hadn't had that, I wouldn't have been able to self-stigmatize. I would have fought when somebody had said, you've got a mood disorder and your whole life is going to change. If I hadn't had those little negative inner voices saying, oh, forget it, you don't deserve anything, I would have said, I deserve a life. I don't care that I've got a diagnosis. I deserve to have all the things that anybody else has.
The more that people are disempowered from making their own treatment decisions, the more people are assessed from a truly medical model and aren't having a voice, you know, the more stigma is perpetuated. It's like the uncooperative, mentally ill person, and if they just take their medication, you know, they don't know what they're doing. I mean, you know, it's the only healthcare environment where you can be, you know, basically incarcerated, have all your decision-making powers taken away, be treated against your will, and as long as there's a system that's so paternalistic like that, the stigma is going to be perpetuated.
I have an idea is that they could greatly diminish self-stigma if they would allow you to have a say in your own treatment. They treated you as a participant rather than a body.
So they can send a message that these people have the same set of whatever as everybody else does. You know, they just have a mental disorder that affects their thinking sometimes, to make us seem like we're not different.
There should be a real emphasis on not shaming themselves. And that should be a really explicit kind of thing. That should be something that, you know, every psychiatrist or mental health worker works with the person on, not shaming themselves for having a mental illness or for losing things while they've had a mental illness.
It doesn't matter if you have somebody sitting with you saying you didn't do anything wrong. You're okay. This is just another health condition. You didn't do anything wrong. All the people in the world can tell you that, and until you really believe it for yourself, then it means nothing, you know. And I would like to sit down with every person who has gotten a diagnosis, who has not been asked how they were feeling, who has just been sent out with a belly full of pills and said, okay, deal with that. You know, I would like to sit down with all of them and ask them how they're feeling and say, you know, but really, how do you feel about yourself? You know, does this change, does this affect how you perceive yourself?
Less disability, more ability. Concentrate less on what is disabling the person and concentrate more on what the person is capable of, you know, instead of handicapped, handy-abled. I guess that's what some people say nowadays. You can't not just treat the person with medication and some polite words and then let them go on their way. You need a constant reinforcement. That person needs to behavior modification. The person needs to be able to fight their way out of the stigma, and that's what a good therapist should do.
It's coming. The government is actually putting money into peer support right now. As I said earlier, they're looking at the spiritual aspect, they're looking at the physical. It is being done, but like anything, it takes time. And it takes time for things to get out into the general population. And unfortunately, the financial side that you have to look at, it takes time. And often government money is wasted. You know, by the time it gets down to the front line, there's nothing left.
I think that people who feel stigmatized have good reason to feel stigmatized. The question is, what can you do about it? A lot of people don't have the wellness or the energy to sort of stand up and fight. But thank God there are agencies that actually deal with some of these social justice issues.
More public awareness made. There would have to be more talks to people in public service, to service groups in our community, to law enforcement people, even to the people in the medical profession. Sometimes very down on these things. When they know nothing about it, they immediately toss it out and say, "Oh, they're a mental patient. You know, don't pay any attention."
You can tell people something in their head. You know, people can have knowledge, but it takes longer to change a heart. And I think, along with education, there needs to be, I guess integration would be the right word, when people get to know people with mental illness and say, you know what, like, and very often, like, I've had people come to me and say, I wouldn't have known had you not told me.
People have to recognize more than just the names and the labels. They have to recognize that there are people underneath those names and labels. And so there has to be some sort of empathy part to any kind of education. And I think that's missing right now.
Slowly but surely, people who are mentally ill there's still value there. And they still have things to offer. And I think that's what society could do, is to allow and nurture and care enough to help a bit, to lend a helping hand, you know.
I think they gotta learn what the word psychotic means.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you watch every late show for the last 30 years, and You know what it means. It's that guy lurking in the bushes with a cleaver in his sock, right? I mean, isn't that what the psychotic is? I mean, there's a lot of work to do.
They have to get over the stigma within themselves, because society is always going to stigmatize you. You can't stop that. So what you have to do is change the way you react to the stigma that society puts on you. You have to change the way you react, because you can't change the opinion of 100,000 people. You can change your opinion.
Yeah, I would really like for people to be able to mention it in the same breath as diabetes or epilepsy or high blood pressure or anything else that is just a medical condition that you have to deal with.